Welcome to The Impact Effect, hosted by conscious leadership expert Tom Eddington, advisor to some of the world's most successful companies and CEOs, where each week we help executives, entrepreneurs, and organizers become more effective leaders while growing businesses that are making an impact in the world. And now, here's Tom.
Hi, welcome to the Impact Effect Network, where we discuss making business matter through conscious leadership. I'm Tom Eddington, and I'm delighted to welcome my friend and colleague, Karen Buckley. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you, Tom. I'm glad to be here with you.
Well, I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I'd like for you to just start by sharing a little bit of your background with our audience.
I've been committed to change in business for a long time, for many decades. I had the luck of my first job outside of college happened to be with a Tibetan Buddhist who had made and lost millions. He brought in practices of meditation and team building, as well as asking me the hard questions that others wouldn't necessarily ask. I went on from there to discover the field of organization development, and I've been there ever since for over 3 decades. I love seeing leaders and their teams and organizations find the capacity to change, and particularly given the world we're operating in now. So that's really my background in terms of work. I've been doing that for a long time with all different types of organizations. My passions are also around wisdom and leadership, spirit and business, and some of those other dimensions to the work that often don't get talked about, but are essential to leaders that are really highly effective.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Karen. And you and I share that very big field of organization development and leadership development. And I too have spent my career in that field, and it's a beautiful field to wander in.
It is indeed. You get to meet so many incredible people who are very devoted to what it is they want to have happen in the world, and that's exciting to see those changes occur.
Well, I'd love it if you could just share a bit about your journey and what you've experienced and what you've seen over the decades of doing the work that you've been doing.
You know, there's a story that comes to mind that I think taught me more than anything. I was fairly new in the field. I was in my early 30s, and I was brought in to facilitate it was the Environmental Protection Agency, their executive team. They had a new director politically appointed, and she wanted to take all these guys, they were all guys at that point, down to a retreat center. And we were going to have a retreat. The department heads of the Water Division and the Inspector General's office and all the different divisions of the EPA, they weren't all that into being together, let alone going off-site, let alone, having some sort of conversation they didn't even begin to understand. And as I was getting the warm-up exercise going as a good facilitator, and I was going over the agenda and the outcomes, and I was leading the team in a first exercise of going around the circle and saying what they were going to bring into the meeting. And I turned my back to write something up on the flip chart, and this voice came in that was resonant and calm and brought forward a quality of presence that was entirely unexpected in what I expected to be a conflict-filled meeting. I turned around and I looked, and here was one of the head lawyers for the EPA. And at the first break, I got an opportunity to walk on the beach and ask him some questions. Who are you? How did you come to do this? And he spoke about that he got up at 4:30 every morning to meditate. And he had a Zen meditation practice. And he was sharp. I went on to work with Bob in a law firm that he left the EPA at some point years later and joined a law firm. I went on to work with him there. And I experienced firsthand what a difference that inner atmosphere makes when we bring it forward into an everyday work situation filled with contradictions and challenges and potential conflicts. And that really changed my journey. I would say that really brought my attention to the invisible side of leadership.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I mean, I can truly appreciate the profound experience it had for you, having, both on a personal level experienced a similar journey of finding a contemplative practice and doing the inner work, but also having worked with leaders and organizations where there's an individual or a number of individuals who have that kind of commitment.
Mm-hmm.
It's a powerful experience when you can witness someone being like that.
Absolutely. And you recognize that it opens for them the window or the door even to greater wisdom, to a greater capacity to understand what the different aspects or dimensions of a problem are, why contradictory solutions might be coming from two different value sets, what the start point and the end point might be of a particular scenario that's getting run out, looking at some of the further consequences, and some of the impacts on both the people and the organization itself, its mission, whether it's a corporation with profits or it's an EPA with a different kind of bottom line, and looking at the impacts on the planet as a whole. So that kind of access of a multidimensional truth, that pure knowing, but also just wise intelligence that we can have when our inner atmosphere is set up to be conducive to listening and to welcoming that kind of insight, that kind of information, that kind of responsiveness to what's changing in the moment. So the capacity, I think wisdom is one of the key characteristics of a conscious leader, is they know how to cultivate wisdom.
So just out of curiosity, and not to leave our viewers and listeners hanging, you went out for on break and you walked with this guy, and it clearly shifted and changed you and the trajectory of your life. But how did his presence affect the outcome of the meeting?
Well, it did. Because as soon as he spoke, they almost had to fight to keep their snarkiness, They almost had to work at it. And a couple of them were very effective, I must say. They were long practiced. But it meant that when we got stuck, we actually were able to get in and do some real work. And it didn't take the whole first day before we could. Sometimes in a meeting like that, you don't get to the real work until day 2. But because Bob kept bringing forward his intelligence, his perceptive comments, because he kept looking for what there was, what the strengths were of the group. He kept looking for what the elements were in each of the different points of view. It meant that we began to do some real work on day 1, and they were very pleased actually with the results of the retreat by the time they left after 3 days. Well, I was just thinking that when I worked with Bob in the law firm as well, he was working on a Superfund cleanup. And there were a lot of lawyers involved, and we were trying to do some intervention in the legal process. And the difference it made there was that it was like there were the legal questions that everybody kept bouncing around, where we could spend hours and hours and dollars in that a fight that occurred. And then there began to be this subtext conversation that it wasn't behind the scenes or anything, but it was a conversation that was moving its way towards a common consensus, towards areas of agreement. So we began to, I like to think of it as a surround sound of strengths and a surround, a system where you actually have stereo going, where everybody's capable, everybody's committed, and let's figure this out together, instead of a surround sound of a more deficit mindset.
How has that shaped the work that you do, and where have you been able to create that same kind of surround sound experience with the organizations and the leaders you've worked with?
Well, that's a great question. I try and do that with every single person I work with, whether it's in executive coaching or it's consulting. Most of my clients are long-term retainer clients, and they work with me. My longest term client is 28 years at this point. So as I get to know them, but just from the very start, my first question's around, where are your strengths and what do you do well? Because I want to help you change as fast and as substantively as you want to. I work with leaders that have a powerful sense of mission and help them accomplish that mission. And in order to do that, I want to build from the foundation that is already there. If you're starting from where you've got problems and issues, where the gaps are if you're starting from what's missing, it's a really steep uphill climb to try and make change. Instead, if you can start from a foundation of sufficiency, a foundation of being able to identify and name and amplify the best practices, being able to look at what gives life to this organization, what does kindle your passion, what moves you forward, then we can begin to amplify that. We can build that in. And these guys have been perpetuating this for 5 years, 6 years. They'd all been working together and they had been perpetuating this conflictual situation. So he began working with me, and we developed ways for his practices and strategies for him to get out of the kind of habitual conversations he'd been in and move into more generative conversations.
Well, it's very aligned with the philosophy I've had for the last 20 years or so about working with organizations and individual leaders in particular on making their strengths even stronger and not wasting their time trying to deal with the weaknesses, unless those weaknesses are going to derail their performance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find it makes, well, yes, and it's important to note the weaknesses. It's important to pay attention to what's missing in order for the next step to occur. But we grew up in schools where the red pen showed us where all the mistakes were. And, I was just on with a client the other day, and she had just done a remarkable presentation. And she said, as soon as I'm off, my inner critic just comes right down heavy. And we began talking about it. And I said, it strikes me that at this point in your career, with all this success under your belt, that inner critic is really unnecessary. And she actually tried to convince me of why it was necessary, of what function it played. And we began to discuss that was part of the inner nature of her conversation that she kept perpetuating, that kept her stuck in the past and kept her repeating the choices that she had made in the past. As another client of mine began to recognize that many years ago, we've worked together 10 years now, she began to shape her own conscious awareness of not only her own strengths and that of her team, but she began to realize her deepest commitment in the world and what she stood for in bringing together empathy and expertise, rather than just the expertise that she was known for. And she began to claim it and own it. And she stood differently when she walked into a meeting. People began to notice. She began to get promoted. She began to get utilized more in high leverage projects. And as her commitment, as she continues to develop over the years, her self-awareness, her mindfulness, her capacity to create, to cultivate an inner wisdom and bring that forward into the work that she does, her words ring out, her reach has grown. And she has set up different kinds of learning situations for people. She's really capable at this point to begin to lead from love as a force for connection and relationship and producing big results, rather than leading from just intelligence and competency and that kind of thing.
I can only imagine that journey that she's been on and how fulfilling it must be for her to have arrived at this point.
I believe that it is. She keeps hiring me, so that's always a good indication. But yeah, absolutely. She and I speak about it often because she has a capacity now that she always guessed she had. But in our work together, she began to discover that capacity and set it free. And we have the freedom to be the leaders we're here to be. It's remarkable what a difference we can make, what a contribution we can make. I have a very simple definition for leadership, which is someone who has the willingness and the ability to act on that which matters most to them. So to act on that which matters most to you. When you find that what matters most and you stand in that commitment, you don't dismiss it. You don't set it aside as unreal. You don't put it out as Pollyannish. You don't do all those other things that we can do but you actually claim it and you put it in front of you. And that's what the best coaching does, is we find that place where it matters the most. And from there, we can develop the willingness and the ability. Skills are easy to develop once you have a clear commitment. But it's hard sometimes when we're inside our own heads to figure out quite the way to go.
You're watching the Impact Effect Network. Who you are is how you lead. Conscious leadership is an intuitive, intentional process requiring an open heart, an open mind, and a committed desire to fully own how you show up in the world. If you're a CEO, a solopreneur, or a community leader, Tom Eddington's ebook helps you amplify your strengths, making you the best version of yourself. Download the ebook today and become a part of bringing conscious leadership to the planet.
How do you expand that to include conscious leadership?
Well, Tom, I don't think conscious leadership is special. I think it is that capacity to know what matters most to us, knowing what our conversations are and what they're generating. Are the conversations that we're engaging in outside of us and inside in our own heads, at home and at work, are those conversations moving forward the kinds of results, the kinds of contribution that we want to be making? Are the words we're using, the phrases we're using, are they creating an inner atmosphere and an outer atmosphere, an ambiance, a context within which other people start to thrive as well? I see conscious leadership as having an ordinariness to it, because I believe that there have been conscious good leaders throughout history. What we've been missing in the past is, I'm guessing here two things. There might be a third that surfaces, but two things come to mind. One is we've been missing a sense of understanding the real mission for business and organizations, that of furthering life on the planet, of creating a context for life for generations to come. And we thought that the mission of a business or an organization was to produce widgets or to control the use of the environment, in the EPA's example. But what we didn't recognize was the role we play in the long-term sustainability and capacity of this earth to be regenerative. And that's where the edge is, certainly for conscious leaders today, is that edge of, is what I am doing contributing to or detracting from the regeneration that is natural and possible in our world today? It's a natural, we live in a regenerative earth. It's a natural part of our context of living. It's a miracle that we have this planet, that these conditions are here such that we humans can be here, that we can be building the buildings, that we can be running the businesses, that we can be doing all of these things. We haven't found another planet that has these conditions or these capability. And anytime we create a man-made environment, it doesn't have a natural regenerative cycle. It has biological or technological outputs that aren't healthy, that don't come back in to that regenerative cycle. So conscious leadership now is bringing in that compelling awareness of our role in shaping the destiny of certainly the people on the planet, as well as all the hundreds and hundreds of species that are going extinct. I'm on the west coast of California, so we're all experiencing the wildfires. And we have friends whose brothers have lost their homes and clients who have lost their homes, and the fire is moving very quickly. The sun is orange when it comes up in the morning. And there's some good things happening. Amazon has a new sustainability criteria that we can search for and buy products that fit that. Cradle to Cradle is a very important sustainability index. There are many ways that we can engage with companies that are choosing consciously to lead in a way that will be environmentally positive for the planet, rather than environmentally negative. There are many choices that are available to us at this point. There's a lot that's already in place that if we simply, again, used it and amplified it, it would make a big difference.
Well, much of what I'm hearing you talk about, and you've used the word wisdom several times. I've witnessed this shift in the last couple of decades where leaders and organizations are starting to place value and attention on wisdom as opposed to knowledge. And I can't point to when and where that shift happened, but I'm seeing the early indicators that we're finally in our organization starting to place value on wisdom. Has that been your experience?
Oh, I think it's a very slow haul. I think the fast pace of business, the KPIs do not include wisdom. Everyone can think of somebody that they know is wise, from their grandmother to the person in the organization that led without even being in a position of leadership, to the person who saved the academic department, and because they behind the scenes were constantly resolving conflicts and helping to bring a bigger perspective, to the leader who listens, to the leader who's very clear with expectations and setting agreements. Everybody has examples. And when I ask the question and I invite them to speak with each other, the faces light up, the room comes alive. It's very hard to pull them back. And then I always ask, Tom, so on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being not at all and 5 being definitely developed, how developed would you say your wisdom is? And there's a few 5s and there's a few 4s, and most people are in the 3 category. And some people look at me quizzically and they recognize they're a 1. They've never paid attention to developing their wisdom, or to understanding that there may be different types of wisdom other than their own, because that's part of wisdom as well, is to understand the wisdom that we don't recognize and to welcome that.
So when you're in dialogue with your clients and the organizations you've worked with, and you share that observation and they have that experience, where does that conversation go?
Well, we bring it into every single conversation we have. I mean, in any coaching session, in any team facilitation, in any, I work with people over years because they're committed to change. I'm always listening for where is the wisdom in what they're saying. You know, there can be a bunch of chips. There can be a bunch of stuff that comes out. It could be complaints. It could be a driving analysis of a situation. It could be all kinds of different, depending on the style of the person. But somewhere in there, there's wisdom. Somewhere in there, there's what matters most to them. And there's some insight or some understanding. I had one of those just the other day with a new client. She and I are working very intensively over this month in order to set her up for an upcoming critical board meeting. And she had all these different limitations and constraints and agendas and things she wanted to do and things she hadn't been able to do. She was fairly new in the organization. And at some point, she spoke to the core of their service and what they could be doing going forward. And when she did, she passed right over it. You know, it was like a blip in the screen. And I brought her back to it. And we began to explore it and we began to expand it. And then from that context of the service that she and her organization most want to be, their service is to veterans. The service that they most want to provide to veterans, from that point of view, we could then begin to design the board of directors meeting. We could then begin to design her leadership and how her next steps with her team. That to me is when you can begin to use wisdom as a framework for looking out and doing the kind of basic strategy and design work that we need to be doing. rather than starting from the standing point of fears or concerns or power games or hunger, envy, any of those kinds of things that where we contract. And we're very effective. We're enormously strategic. We're super smart. It is a kind of intelligence that we bring forward, but it's lacking the wisdom to see what the unforeseen consequences might be.
And what was your experience of her going through that process? What did you witness? What shifted for her in the process of that conversation?
Well, she began to trust what mattered to her. She began to trust what lives in her heart, and she began to speak about how much she cares. She went from, my experience was, if I think about it somatically, she went from actually her shoulders being bowed. She was really feeling beaten down. She was feeling the weight of the responsibility of all that wasn't working on her shoulders. She began to see a way through. I said earlier, wisdom opens doors. It opens doors of perceptions. When we have a mindset that's an old mindset that's based in fear or based in worry or survival instincts, it's easy to get emotionally hijacked. It's easy to miss cues in the environment. It's easy to have tunnel vision. But instead, when we can transform that mindset so that it's something that's going to move us forward into the future and bring other people along with us, then that kind of mindset can determine a future that includes more wisdom. A brief example of a mindset with another client from many years ago. I came into a new organization, and there was a new executive director that had come in, and he said, "I need you to work with my CFO." He said, "He's such a smart guy, but when I get him into meetings, he just sits there. He kind of has his head down. He's got his shoulders bowed. He doesn't show up, and I need him to stand there and speak as intelligently as he is, and he just doesn't do it. He kind of slouches." So I went in and I started working with this guy. And I thought, oh, he's so smart and he's so committed. He knows exactly what he's doing. But I noticed as soon as we got into any difficult conversation, I noticed him slip into that body posture. I said to him, "Okay, so what is going on?" And we went through it, because one of the most powerful pieces of my work is working with leaders to transform those mindsets that pull them back, that keep them down. So we went into the mindset level, and we were able to track back to something his mom told him when he was 8 years old, that he was mean. And I won't go into the story. It's a very simple story, but we all lock in those thoughts when we're young. We simply grab them and we take them, and somebody else might have taken, if their mom said that, they might have said, "No way, I am not." But he didn't. He locked it in as if it was a certain truth. So that became an operating system for him. And just as when we have an old operating system in a computer, we can't quite get it to do what we need it to do. What was happening was, anytime he would walk in and he had bad news, or he had a stand to take around the finances of the organization, he would worry about being mean. It was completely unconscious. He had no idea this was what he was doing, but somatically, he would shrink. He would make himself smaller. And by doing so, he was ending up with results that he didn't anticipate. So I'm always helping leaders look at, what are your results that you like? And how can we amplify those? What are the mindsets that are strong, that actually are conditions out of which these results are created? And what are the results that aren't so hot? What are the results that aren't really working? What is it that you're dismayed by? What is it you're disturbed by? What is it you wish could be different? And how are you behaving such that you're creating those results? And what mindset underlies that behavior? And when can begin to identify that, a doorway opens. Again, it's the best analogy I can use, but they begin to access capabilities, strengths, and capacities that they didn't have before. It's why I love the work I do, because I see such vast, enormous change. I see people who have a sense of mission that have been stymied. I see them able to kick that into gear and really get some things done that matter a lot to them. They get to be the leader they're here to be.
You're watching the Impact Effect Network, the world's first 24-hour on-demand business and leadership video and podcast network, bringing conscious leadership to a global audience.
So talking about some of the information you've shared around leadership, around wisdom, what doors are you seeing organizations starting to walk through when we look at the opportunities that exist in the world, the challenges that exist? What are you seeing that you'd like to share?
Well, one that comes to mind is this morning I was on a call convening a panel, another part of the Humanity Rising Global Solutions Summit. And one of our speakers was from the World Wildlife Fund. And she spoke about a program that they have just begun in the World Wildlife Fund called For Nature, For Us. And this program is bringing forward, sorry, slamming doors in the background here. I don't know if that's going through. That program is bringing forward the capacity for all of us to take a look at how the work we're doing, the way we treat the environment, is impacting the equilibrium of the living system, and how that living system, that disequilibrium, is actually creating pandemics. So Jan is the senior advisor of the Vertife is the senior advisor of this program, and they're working with government agencies to change policies. They're working with organizations. They're working with leaders all around the world in 100 countries. The WWF, World Wildlife Fund, works to actually begin to change the way they work and discover an alignment that brings them to a felt sense of humanity. I see in engineering firms that I work with that they are taking up more and more of the practices of green engineering. I see in wealth management field, I'm just kind of quickly scanning a couple different things I can see right now, where they're beginning to take up some of the deeper, richer questions of what really effect money has in people's lives, and how money plays a role in oftentimes in a marriage, working or not working, and accepting some responsibility for orienting or guiding the conversations in such a way that begins to shift. I'm also seeing in organizations like Google and some of the other, LinkedIn, Google has the Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute that got started there, and has gone on to move around the world in significant ways in teaching people mindfulness and how to bring themselves into a self-awareness. Because when we can become aware of our mindsets and of our patterns, then we can become aware of how and when we typically get hijacked. What that inferior function is, that less developed part of us, that weaker, more vulnerable part of us, and why that comes out when we least want it or least expect it, when or least hope that it'll be there. And until we can develop that kind of self-knowledge and self-mastery, it's very difficult to, when things get tough, as they are right now, in the conundrum that we're facing between all the confluence of different forces that we're up against, until we can understand that the impact of all of these coming together and being in conflict with each other is what we're having to embrace the disturbance with enough self-knowledge and self-mastery that we can begin to move the team, begin to move the organization in a more productive manner. I watched the difference between organizations that had some of these practices in place when all of a sudden the pandemic hit and it was time to quarantine. and people had to work from home. And the organizations that had these practices in place, that had really developed in their leadership and their capacity to lead as a team, they were able to make the change in a day or in a weekend. For the organizations that had not developed that capacity, the organizations that were still functioning from a place of competition that wasn't actually moving everybody to work together, they ran into some big difficulties, both with their servers and with their equipment and with the staff and the team. And they found that they couldn't trust or rely on the team to produce the kinds of results they wanted them to produce when they were all of a sudden at home. So I think the impacts can be seen every day, and particularly in a time like this where there's so many forces that are not only within our companies, but between companies. And very little can get done now unless you're looking between companies at what the impacts are. And then we have global threats that are now coming that are not within just one nation. They cross nations, whether it's the pandemic or climate disruption or leadership that isn't suited for the job and creating devastating impacts both for that country and others. This capacity for a conscious leader to embrace disturbance, to welcome information they hadn't considered before, even when it's contrary to what they want to know, what they thought was true, to consider ideas that are not familiar, to overcome their initial fixed reactions, and to stay open to new information, to stay open to new ideas, and to step into a broader perspective. All of that is needed, I believe, in companies everywhere today. And especially as they look to get out of simply whitewashing or greenwashing, as it's called, and putting forward marketing messages that sound green, but they're not really changing supply chains, they're not really changing the way the organization is structured, and instead to develop a disciplined alignment within the company with a felt sense of humanity and with the living system that we're all part of and that we're all living inside of. Because out of our will and out of our capacity as conscious leaders really lies the future that we birth for the rest of the world and for each other. And for business in the future, our businesses are not going to be sustainable on a non-sustainable planet. I mean, that's the bottom line at this point. And if we can't face that outer collapse and hopelessness with a sense of developing an inner equanimity, an inner equilibrium, an inner awareness of and the kinds of mindsets that allow us to be strong and steady even in the face of that, we're going to find ourselves in more and more of a tailspin. And I think that we can see that in companies that pretty rapidly went downhill, including the fashion industry they were certainly making steps to look at having environmental supply chains, environmentally conscious supply chains and things, but not sufficiently. They were moving slowly, and the impact of something like this hit them very hard and very fast.
You're watching the Impact Effect Network. Is your team tuned out? Are you looking for a powerful speaker to motivate and inspire your organization? Then Tom Eddington is the choice for keynote speaker at your next conference or event. Tom is one of the most sought-after business advisors and coaches in Silicon Valley. For over 2 decades, Tom has advised world-renowned CEOs and executives on how to catapult their organization's success, including Hewlett-Packard, NBNA Corporation, and Royal Dutch Shell. In his dynamic keynotes, Tom offers fresh new paradigms on how to create healthier, happier, and more purposeful workplaces while navigating change and generating higher degrees of success for organizations. For information on booking Tom at your next event, contact eddingtonadvisory.com.
Well, you touched on a couple of things that you're saying leaders need to develop capacity for. Are there other things that you, just looking at the landscape, other capabilities, other capacities, other other things that leaders need to be doing to be effective in the future that I think my assessment of the future is very much aligned with in what you articulated. And so where is it that leaders need to be focusing their time and attention, and where do they need to be developing?
Well, I have a rather radical new direction that I'm speaking about now. It feels radical, not because it's new in my own mind or consciousness, but because it's not something that's been spoken about in business, which is I'm really asking the question, how can we lead with love? And I've written several blogs on this now. We recently, I usually have a women's retreat every year on the island of Molokai, Hawaii. And it's a rich, wonderful time with where we discuss leadership and some of the constraints to leadership, but all of the strengths and possibilities that are there, what matters most to us, what our hearts teach us. But because of the pandemic, of course, we weren't able to go into fly to Hawaii, fly 20 women to Hawaii this year for a lifetime experience, extraordinary experience. So instead, we switched the retreat to be online, and I have another one coming up in October 19th, it'll begin. And there were many leadership lessons that emerged from this program when we offered it in May. One of them is that as leaders, it's important for us to recognize that there are diverse doorways into love, that some of us have a preference to discover love and find love and anchor our experiences of love through relationships. As soon as they're not feeling love, they reach out to somebody. They get charged up by going out and engaging with other people. And they're just masters at cultivating relationships and cultivating love through relationships. Other people, not so much the relationship side. They find that they're stronger at, this is where I am, I find that I'm stronger at finding and refinding love and anchoring myself back in love in a more interior place. So that's the doorway I walk through when I'm off base or when I'm missing the capacity in myself to bring love into my interactions, to come from love. I'm not talking about ooey gooey love. I'm not talking about romantic love. I'm not talking about the kind of love that you have that is then fleeting. I'm speaking more about it as a state of being, as a place to come from. And so I recognize that my interior direction, by going inside, I can rekindle that state of love. I can connect with that, and then I bring that forward. Singers, dancers, they connect, create it through the creative doorway. One of my good colleagues loves to run up on Mount Tamalpais above our town here, and he comes back, he's just beaming. It just brings him back into his love for his family, his love for his work, his love for the planet. So there are many different ways into love. And of course, there's the transcendent doorway into love, the people who love the chants, spiritual rituals, going to church, whatever that experience is for them that takes them into that relationship with spirit as the way that they come into love. So that's one of the lessons that we speak about in terms of how do you grow love. One of the ways as a leader is to recognize that different people have different preferences, and you yourself have different preferences. If you can get to know your own doorway into love, then you can develop practices and construct times in your life where you're able to bring love forward more readily, where even if you lose it, you can re-find it. Where if you get off center, you can rebalance and find the way that you can bring it and move it forward. I spoke earlier about another, which is your habitual conversations. And your internal messages to yourself might be keeping you from experiencing love, or might steer you into more love. What is your inner conversation? Is it cruel or is it kind? Is it mean or is it encouraging? Is it real or is it trying to fake it? All of those change our capacity to be in love, to be in a state of love, that place that we can naturally kindle in ourselves. And as leaders, when we can affirm when we can choose love as a mindset, I think that's the edge of leadership at this point. Given all of the disturbances that we're embracing, all the ways that business is changing, all the ways that our planet, we've reached 1 million deaths in the pandemic. I don't even remember the number of the rate of extinction, and the number of animals and insects and birds have gone extinct. It's just too hard to hold in my brain because it hurts. We have to find something that shifts the pattern. And I think we know what it is. And in some way, we've stepped aside from it. It feels risky even saying it. I've built my career on being very pragmatic and helping people create remarkable results. And I might be a bit far out, but I'm always close enough to the center that it works. And speaking about love, love is a mindset that really transcends boundaries as a place where we can confidently infuse the places and spaces of our work, where we can turn a performance review from an experience in criticism to an experience of love. I've done that with organizations now, where they look forward to the performance reviews because it's an opportunity to celebrate each other, to fan the flames of what they're doing well, and to identify where they want to grow next, what it is that's speaking to them, and align all of that with their own values as a company, as an organization. So I think that's probably my leading edge. That's what's out there on, a colleague of mine talks about the frothy edges, that out on the edge, out on the leading edge, there's a lot of turmoil. There's more possibility, and there's more of a sense of that liminal space, the chaos, the unknowns, the disturbance. And only by embracing that and do we start to find the wisdom that we want to bring into our leadership. I would just love it if every person was walking around and celebrating each other's wisdom, looking for it, identifying it, making it concrete and specific. I really appreciate the way you were wise today, the way you considered multiple options and brought those in. I'd love it if we walked around and looked for love, for a place where we stand in a commitment that is so strong that we can move planets, that we can move people, we can move organizations, because we care so deeply and so much. And I really truly believe in the human spirit that if we can kindle that, we can accomplish anything. Look at what we accomplished when we declared a pandemic. It was fast, the changes that occurred. When we all align around what needs to be done, we can begin to make changes.
Well, it's wonderful that you're seeing love is out there on the sort of the leading edge of what's next for leadership. And for me, it's a slightly different frame. Instead of how do we bring love into organizations? How do we not?
I love that, Tom.
It's from my perch on the world, it's essential. It's absolutely critical. And if we don't bring love into the conversations, into our relationships in the workplace and outside of the workplace, we're not going to be around as a species. Our organizations aren't going to survive.
No, we're truly at a choice point. We really are. The author Bell Hooks had a beautiful quote in her book, Return to Love. I feel our nation is turning away from love, moving into a wilderness of spirit so intense we may never find our way home again. I write of love to bear witness both to the danger in this movement and to call for a return to love. How can we not? I love your question, Tom, that you asked. What reason would we have to wait at this point? If we simply look at the state of the world, how could we lack courage? Sure, it's a mess. Sure, we don't exactly know how to take care of it. Sure, there's more complexity here than any of us can wrap our heads around in a lot of these messes and trying to unsnarl them. But the surest way into resolving a mess is to stand true in your commitment to resolve it and to get together with like-minded people who can join you in a commitment, in a shared commitment.
So I'm feeling an ever increasing sense of urgency that we find our way to love, and there's so much at stake, but there's so much to be gained when we can find ourselves in that place.
What do you find changes in your life?
For me, it affects the quality of my daily life. It affects the quality of my daily experiences, of my relationships with other people in my life.
Mm-hmm.
It really takes me back to what it means to be human.
It changes my relationship with the natural world.
Yes.
One of the early definitions when I first began studying wisdom and leadership, I interviewed Randall Hayes of the Rainforest Action Network. And Randy said, wisdom is when you are in sync with nature's ways. And I think that's what love does as well. It brings us back into our wisdom and back in sync with nature's ways so we can begin to create and work together for the regeneration and the future of the planet.
And when we find ourselves in that place, and I'm very human, so I wander away from that synchronicity. But when I'm back in that place, or when nature reminds me, the messages, the synchronicities in my life, that sense of ease and flow is just absolutely remarkable.
It is. It's a lot more fun, isn't it? I mean, I often have leaders identify when they get to a mindset that's at the root of some of the results that they don't like, and I ask them to begin to notice what some of the benefits and costs are of that mindset. And there have to be benefits, or they wouldn't have been having it for that many years. But boy, when we get into the costs, it's a poignant conversation.
Yeah, because
we all know them. We all know the less graceful moments of our lives.
Yeah, unfortunately, all too well.
Absolutely. It's why consciousness is not a state. It's a continual practice.
Yes.
And it's why being conscious leaders is not a stage to reach. It's a trajectory. It's a journey to be on.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, no surprise, Karen, this was a wonderful journey. Speaking of journeys, this time we've had together today, and I would just appreciate if you could share what's the one thing or a couple of things you'd like the listeners to and viewers to take away from our conversation.
It's a little, I'm reconsidering now after this past hour of conversation. I'd love the listeners to take away to trust their own commitment, to trust what matters to you, what matters most to you, and whether that's in your neighborhood or your community or your company or the world, trust that and turn it into a commitment that you wake up every day and that you say and that you act from. And then I think the second thing I'd love you to take away is to then put that commitment in the center of a big piece of paper, and around that, write what results in your life are consistent with or in alignment with that commitment, and what results are not. And identify one or maybe two, but really be tender with this process, and look back at what behavior creates that result and what mindset might be driving that behavior. I think the other thing is to make it a practice to affirm wisdom, your own and others, because we are all wise and wisdom is always unfolding right around us at all times, if we but notice it. if we but amplify it, bring it forward, give it light, give it air, give it wings.
Well, thank you, Karen. And for folks who want to connect with you, what's the best way for them to reach you?
Well, please come to my website, communicoreconsulting.com. And I have not only information on my work there, but there's also ways to contact me. I'm happy to receive your emails. I love to hear from people and either what the questions are that you're contemplating, where you're feeling stuck, or what it is that most matters to you, what it is you want to accomplish. I also have on the website, on the Communicore Consulting website, I have several years worth of blogs where I'm considering questions that are there for me and for my clients and exploring those together.
It's been a delight spending the last hour with you.
Thank you.
You're watching the Impact Effect Network. Thank you for joining Tom Eddington on the Impact Effect. Visit impacteffectnetwork.com to connect with Tom and discover additional episodes featuring today's top leaders making a global impact through conscious leadership in the world today.